The audio file arrived at 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday. No name, no return number, just a voice. Calm, deliberate, and unmistakably familiar with the inside of a federal building. 14 seconds, that was all it took. They didn't lose those files, the voice said. They buried them deliberately, and the order didn't come from inside DOJ. Crockett listened to that recording 3 times before dawn. A source, someone with direct knowledge, someone claiming that evidence from Jeffrey Epstein's client list, names, records, materials recovered from the Manhattan search, had been deliberately suppressed. Not misplaced, not delayed by legal process. Buried on purpose by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Pull everything on Manhattan, she said. We're going in differently tomorrow. But here's what almost no one in that room knew yet. The folder Crockett carried wasn't just about what was found in that Manhattan residence. It was about what was found and then quietly made to disappear. And the gap between those two things, that gap was about to become the worst 40 minutes of Pam Bondi's professional life. Journalists who normally covered budget markups had found seats. Staffers assigned elsewhere had quietly rerouted their mornings. Word had spread the way it always does in Washington. Not through announcements, but through the particular silence of people who know something is coming. Attorney General Pam Bondi entered at exactly 9:08 a.m. 27 years of legal experience, confirmed by the Senate. A woman who had survived confirmation battles, hostile press cycles, and sustained criticism over the pace of Epstein file releases. She moved with the practiced composure of someone who genuinely believed she was prepared for this room. But Crockett had listened to that recording 3 times, and what she had heard wasn't a rumour. It was a roadmap. The first 40 minutes proceeded exactly as Bondi's team had scripted. Budget allocations, staffing metrics, coordination with federal partners. Bondi answered with ease, fluent and untroubled. The kind of composure that comes from thorough preparation and complete confidence in that preparation. Then her name was called. Attorney General Bondi, she began, her voice carrying a calm. The room immediately recognised as something different from the morning's tone. I want to start with a simple question about the 2019 search of Jeffrey Epstein's Manhattan residence. The FBI conducted that search, correct? That is correct, Congresswoman. And among the materials recovered, the FBI catalogued items as potentially relevant to identifying individuals within Epstein's network of associates, including, according to reporting at the time, photographic materials and records found inside a secured safe on the premises. Bondi's posture did not change, but 2 members of her legal team exchanged a glance lasting less than a second. I'd want to be precise about what materials are covered by existing legal protections before... I'm not asking you to characterise specific items, Crockett said, her tone never rising. I'm asking whether investigators believed those materials were relevant to identifying associates. Yes or no? That would be consistent with the purpose of the search. Yes. Good. Crockett opened the folder, not theatrically, but the way someone opens a document they have already read many times. Then I need to ask you about the Epstein client list, because, Attorney General, you confirmed publicly earlier this year that such a list exists within FBI holdings. Director Patel confirmed the same. And yet the individuals named on that list have faced, to the American public's knowledge, effectively no consequences. So my question is straightforward. What happened to the investigative follow-up on those names? The room seemed to drop in temperature. But what came next wasn't the question Bondi expected, and that was exactly the point. Attorney General Bondi, Crockett continued, I received information from a source with direct knowledge of internal DOJ communications. This source alleges that evidence connected to the Epstein client list, specific materials from the Manhattan search, was deliberately not escalated. Not because of legal barriers, not because of grand jury protections, but because a decision was made, somewhere in this chain of command, that certain names on that list would not be pursued. She paused. I need you to tell me, under oath, whether you have any knowledge of instructions given to you or by you directing how those materials would be handled. 11 seconds of silence. Several reporters stopped typing entirely. I'm not aware of any improper handling of materials, Congresswoman. I didn't say improper, Crockett said immediately. I said deliberate, and I'd asked the committee to note that distinction for the record. Then she looked down at the folder, turned a single page, and continued without looking up. Let me ask you something about the client list specifically. You're an experienced attorney. You understand what it means when investigators have names, have documentation, have individuals connected to a network this significant, and yet only one person from that entire inner circle was ever convicted. 1. His longtime associate, his accountant, who reportedly sought to cooperate for years, was barely engaged until very late in the process. His personal pilot, who logged those flights for over a decade, gave statements that went without meaningful follow-up for an extended period. She raised her eyes. Attorney General Bondi, does that sound like every lead connected to that client list was pursued? No answer. Because here is what Bondi still hadn't addressed. The source who contacted Crockett hadn't just alleged suppression. The source had alleged coordination between DOJ and FBI leadership. And the name that kept appearing in those alleged communications wasn't a career official. It was someone with direct access to both. Bondi responded with a careful 40 seconds about prosecutorial discretion and the complexity of multi-jurisdictional investigations, every word technically defensible, nothing actually answering the question. Crockett waited. Then she asked the next one. I want to raise something directly. Attorney General, my serious concern, and I want to be honest with you about this, is not simply that mistakes were made. I'm skeptical that someone of your experience and background makes mistakes this consistent without awareness of what those mistakes protect. She leaned forward slightly. You are a trained prosecutor. You know what happens when you don't review primary evidence and rely only on summaries. You know what that creates. You know what it allows. A pause. So I'll ask you plainly, were you ever made aware, through any channel, formal or informal, that certain individuals connected to the Epstein client list had what might be called protection from escalation within this process? I want to be clear that I take the integrity of... And I want to be clear, Crockett interrupted, that I have serious doubts about your sincerity on that point, not because I think you're incompetent. The opposite, actually. I think you are fully aware of what you did and did not review. And I think the American people deserve to know whether that awareness came with instructions. Something shifted in Bondi's face then. The composure held. She was too disciplined for it not to, but the effort behind holding it had become visible. Her eyes were bright in a way that was not composed brightness. The muscles along her jaw were working. When she reached for her water glass, her hand moved with the deliberate steadiness of someone actively preventing a tremor. And then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, her breath caught in the open microphone. Her eyes went briefly glassy. She blinked it back with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years refusing to let a room see her flinch. Her voice, when it came, carried a slight elevation it had not carried at 9 o'clock. For the first time in the hearing, the weight behind her composure was heavier than the composure itself. Pam Bondi was not going to cry. But in that moment, she was visibly holding back something that, 40 minutes earlier, she had been certain she would never feel in this room. Let me ask you something else, Crockett said, her voice dropping lower now, more deliberate, more dangerous than anything she'd said before. There are high-profile individuals connected to the materials recovered from that Manhattan search. Some of them have resources that historically create certain complications for investigators, certain pressures. She looked directly at Bondi. Is it your testimony today that none of those individuals, none of the names on that client list, had any form of informal protection from escalation within DOJ or FBI during the period you've overseen this investigation? Bondi said carefully, I am not aware of any such protection. You're not aware, Crockett repeated. Not that it didn't happen, that you're not aware. Silence. Attorney General Bondi, certain information connected to high-profile figures in this case has already reached the public, in some cases through what appear to have been inadvertent disclosures. And yet you're telling this committee that the most sensitive materials from a search that federal investigators themselves described as significant, somehow never generated the follow-through that any other investigation of this magnitude would have generated. If the accidental disclosures revealed what they revealed, what exactly do you think the deliberate concealment is protecting? Bondi had no answer. And in that silence, the room understood that the absence of an answer was itself an answer. I'll say this directly, Attorney General, Crockett continued. I don't believe you will be in this position much longer, not because of this hearing alone, but because the administration you serve has shown a consistent pattern of parting ways with officials who become liabilities rather than assets. You told this committee you trust the president's judgment. I'd suggest, respectfully, that trust may not be reciprocal. When the choice comes between protecting this investigation's credibility and protecting you, I think you already know which one gets protected. She paused, letting that land. You took an oath, Attorney General, a serious one, and I think somewhere in you, you know that the answers you've given today fall short of that oath. Whether that's because you're afraid of what full transparency would expose, or because you received instructions you felt you couldn't refuse, I don't know. But the American people are watching, and they already know more than you seem to think they do. She closed the folder. I sincerely hope you remember that oath before someone else decides to remember it for you. Bondi left the hearing room 12 minutes later, no questions from reporters. Her security detail moved her quickly toward the elevator bank, and the doors closed on a face that had, somewhere in the last 40 minutes, lost the brightness it had carried when she walked in. 3 weeks later, she was removed by the president she had called a friend. Washington had seen faster falls, but few had been predicted so precisely in real time by someone sitting across a table with a closed folder and an audio file she had listened to 3 times before dawn. Crockett never played that recording publicly. She never needed to, because the most devastating thing about that hearing wasn't what Crockett said. It was what Bondi couldn't. So here is the only question that matters now, and we want your answer in the comments. Was the audio tip Crockett received a genuine warning from someone inside the system who finally couldn't stay silent? Or was it a coordinated pressure campaign designed to remove Bondi from a position she was never fully trusted to hold by people who needed her gone before she said too much? One answer means a whistleblower told the truth about the Epstein client list. The other means someone powerful enough to orchestrate this entire sequence is still in the room. Type your answer. The people making these decisions are counting on your silence. And that silence is not accidental. It never is. Because in Washington, silence is a strategy. It is chosen, shaped, and deployed at the exact moment when answers become dangerous. What happened in that room did not end when the hearing adjourned. It didn't end when the cameras cut away or when the headlines moved on to something safer, something easier to explain. It continued, quietly, inside offices where phones stopped ringing as often, where meetings were suddenly rescheduled, where certain names were no longer said out loud. Think about that gap again. Not what was found, but what disappeared after it was found. Evidence doesn't erase itself. Files don't bury themselves. Decisions are made. Orders are given. And those orders, if the source was telling the truth, did not originate where everyone was looking. That means the real centre of gravity in this story was never the investigation itself. It was the pressure around it. The invisible boundaries that determined how far it could go and who it could touch. Because here's the part that should make you pause. If even a fraction of what was implied in that exchange is real, then this was never just about Epstein. It was about the network around him, the names that carried influence, the people who, if exposed fully, wouldn't just face legal consequences. They would destabilise institutions. Financial, political, maybe even international. And when that kind of risk enters the equation, investigations stop being purely legal. They become strategic. Watch closely how this unfolded. A single audio file, 14 seconds, no verification presented publicly, no official acknowledgement. And yet it was enough to shift the trajectory of a federal hearing, rattle a seasoned attorney general, and, within weeks, coincide with her removal from office. That sequence is not normal. That sequence suggests leverage. The kind of leverage that doesn't need to be shouted because everyone in the room already understands what it means. And Crockett, she never overplayed it. That's what makes it more unsettling. She didn't reveal the source, she didn't release the recording, she didn't even push for a dramatic conclusion in that moment. She just applied pressure, precisely, repeatedly, and in full view of people trained to recognise what pressure like that usually signals. Which raises a question most people haven't asked yet. What did she know that she chose not to say? Because restraint like that doesn't come from uncertainty. It comes from confidence, from knowing that what you already have is enough to force a reaction. And a reaction is exactly what followed, not just from Bondi, but from the system around her. Quiet shifts, subtle distancing, the kind of internal recalibration that happens when something or someone becomes too risky to stand next to. So now we're left with 2 competing realities. In one, a whistleblower inside the system reached a breaking point. Someone who had seen enough, heard enough, and decided that the only way to force accountability was to bypass the official channels entirely. To send a message that couldn't be filtered, couldn't be delayed, couldn't be ignored. In that version, what happened in that hearing was the first visible crack in something much larger, something that may still be unfolding behind closed doors. In the other reality, that audio file wasn't a warning. It was a move. A calculated insertion into a moment designed to create maximum impact with minimal exposure. A way to shift power without leaving fingerprints. Because if you can influence the narrative at exactly the right time, you don't need to prove anything immediately. You just need to make doubt unavoidable. And once doubt is in the room, it does the work for you. Now ask yourself, who benefits? Not in theory, not in speculation, but in outcome. Who walked away with more control after that hearing? Who avoided scrutiny? Who gained distance from the questions that were being asked? Because power rarely disappears. It relocates, it adapts, and sometimes it hides in plain sight while everyone is focused on the wrong figure at the table. This is where the story stops being about a single hearing. It becomes about a pattern, about how information moves or doesn't move through systems that are designed to manage it, about how certain investigations accelerate while others stall without explanation, and about how every once in a while something slips through, a recording, a document, a moment that wasn't supposed to happen the way it did. The question is not whether something happened. You watched it happen. The question is why it happened that way and what it was trying to accomplish. Because whatever that audio file was, it changed the trajectory of real people, in real time, at the highest levels of power. And things that can do that don't come from nowhere. So don't look away now. Don't assume the story is over just because the hearing ended. Stories like this don't end cleanly. They fade, they fracture, they resurface when you least expect it. And when they do, the details you're seeing now, the pauses, the wording, the silence, those are the clues that will start to make sense in ways they don't yet. Watch the names, watch who speaks and who suddenly stops speaking, watch what gets investigated next, and what quietly doesn't. Because the truth in cases like this isn't always revealed in one moment. Sometimes it builds, piece by piece, until one day the gap between what was found and what was hidden becomes too large to ignore. And when that moment comes, the people who were counting on silence will already be hoping it's too late. And here's where it turns again, quietly but decisively. Because moments like that don't just expose cracks, they test who's watching closely enough to see through them. In the days that followed, there were no dramatic announcements, no urgent press briefings, no official acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened. But inside the system, something had shifted, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable to the people who know how to read it. Meetings that were once routine became restricted, access tightened, language changed, not publicly, but internally, the kind of language that replaces clarity with distance. Words like ongoing review, procedural limitations, jurisdictional boundaries. Phrases designed not to explain, but to slow things down, to create space. Because when pressure builds too fast, the first response isn't always confrontation. Sometimes it's containment, and that raises a deeper question. If there was nothing to hide, why the shift at all? Because institutions don't adjust behaviour without a reason. Especially not institutions trained to maintain consistency under scrutiny. Something in that hearing introduced uncertainty, not just for the public, but for the people inside the structure itself. The kind of uncertainty that makes even insiders start asking quiet questions. Not out loud, not on record, but enough to change how information flows.